Chapter 53, Private Reunion. The world was still screaming, but for the first time in my life, I couldn't hear it. We had crossed the bridge into the Hamptons an hour ago, leaving the siren-filled chaos of Manhattan behind. Behind us lay the sterling Blackwood Plaza, the wall of cameras, and the ghost of the locked-in contract. Ahead of us lay nothing but the dunes, the dark Atlantic, and the house with the big windows. Alexander was driving. His hands, usually so tight on the wheel as if he were trying to steer the planet itself, were relaxed. He looked over at me, the moonlight catching the silver in his eyes. "You're very quiet," he noted, his voice a low, warm vibration that made my skin prickle. "I'm just listening to the silence," I said, reaching over to rest my hand on his thigh. "It's a different kind of quiet than the penthouse. That place felt like a vacuum. This feels like a breath." He took my hand, interlacing our fingers. "It's a life, Maya, a real one. No security logs, no biometric overrides, just a door and a key." We pulled into the driveway. The house stood like a beacon of glass and cedar against the blackness of the ocean. There were no floodlights, no armored SUVs in the perimeter, just the soft glow of the interior lamps we'd left on. As the engine died, the roar of the surf took over. It was constant, rhythmic, and ancient. It reminded me that while our empires rose and fell, the earth didn't care. Alexander walked around to my side of the SUV and opened the door. He didn't offer a hand to help me out. He knew I didn't need it. But as I stepped out into the salt-heavy air, he pulled me into his arms, burying his face in the crook of my neck. "We're home," he whispered. "Actually home," I agreed, clinging to his blazer. We walked into the house. It still smelled of new wood and the lavender sachets I'd hidden in the drawers. I kicked off my heels, the cool floorboards a relief against my tired feet. Alexander tossed his keys on the entry table, a simple piece of driftwood, not obsidian, and turned to me. The public declaration was only 3 hours old, but the adrenaline was finally fading, leaving behind a deep, pulsing hunger that had nothing to do with food or sleep. We stood in the foyer, the moonlight streaming through the glass, casting long, blue shadows across the floor. "I've been wanting to get you alone since you stepped onto that stage," Alexander said, his eyes darkening as he stepped into my space. "You were a goddess tonight, Maya. I watched you dismantle my family's history with a smile, and I realized I've never been more in love with anyone in my life." "I wasn't dismantling your history, Alexander," I said, reaching up to unknot his tie. "I was clearing the space for ours." I pulled the silk strip from around his neck and dropped it on the floor. I began on the buttons of his shirt, my hands steady, my eyes locked on his. The power shift we had navigated for weeks had finally found its level. I was the CEO, he was the partner, and in this room we were simply two souls who had survived the fire. "The reunion," he breathed, his hands finding my waist. "No more masks." "No more masks," I promised. Alexander POV. I had spent 34 years thinking that intimacy was a variable to be managed. A transaction of heat and release that kept the engine running. But as Maya's fingers moved against my chest, I realized that I had never truly been touched until she came into my life. Every graze of her knuckles, every breath she took against my skin, felt like a reclamation. She wasn't just my wife, she was the architect of the man I was becoming. I led her toward the bedroom, but we didn't make it that far. We stopped by the large window overlooking the dunes. The Atlantic was a churning mass of silver and ink, the foam glowing white in the dark. I pulled her back against me, my arms wrapping around her waist. She leaned her head back against my shoulder, her hair smelling of the city and the sea. "Look at it, Maya," I murmured into her ear. "The world is huge, and we're just a tiny part of it. For the first time, I don't feel the need to own the horizon." "Because you have the heart," she whispered, her hand finding mine over her stomach. I turned her in my arms, the silk of her violet suit smooth under my palms. I reached out and traced the line of her jaw, my thumb lingering on her lower lip. She looked radiant, her eyes filled with a fire that I no longer wanted to control. I wanted to burn in it. "I love you," I said, the words feeling like the most powerful thing I'd ever possessed. "I love you too, Alexander." I claimed her mouth then, a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with the residue of everything we had endured. It tasted of the champagne from the gala, the salt of the Swiss snow, and the absolute, unshakable truth of our union. This was the private reunion, the moment where the locked-in era officially transitioned into the claim. I lifted her onto the wide wooden windowsill, my hands sliding up her thighs, bunching the fabric of her skirt. She wrapped her legs around my waist, pulling me flush against the hard, demanding line of her desire. The seductive tension that had been building since we left Manhattan exploded into a raw, unbridled need. In the moonlight, with the ocean as our only witness, we tore at each other's clothes with a frantic, desperate energy. We weren't the Blackwood Sterling Titans anymore. We were just two people who had found each other in the dark and were finally brave enough to stay there. I touched her with a reverence that made my own breath hitch. I wanted to memorize every curve, every scar, every inch of the woman who had set me free. I kissed the pulse point in her neck, the hollow of her throat, the swell of her breasts. Every touch was an apology for the man I used to be, and a vow for the man I was now. When I finally moved inside her, I felt a surge of emotion so intense it was almost a physical pain. It was a merging of souls, a crossing of the final line that the law couldn't define and the press couldn't see. We moved together in the rhythm of the surf, a slow, agonizingly beautiful dance of survival and surrender. "You're mine," I groaned against her lips. "Not by contract, not by debt, just mine." "And you're mine," she gasped, her fingers digging into my shoulders. "The man who set me free." As we reached the peak together, the world outside, the board, the press, the fallout, it all vanished. There was only the heat of the room, the scent of jasmine, and the realization that the room was finally, truly full. Maya POV. We lay on the rug in front of the window for a long time, wrapped in a single cashmere throw. The moon had moved higher in the sky, casting a brilliant silver path across the water. Alexander was holding me from behind, his chin resting on the top of my head, his heart thudding a slow, steady rhythm against my back. This was the quiet I had been fighting for. "We should go to bed," Alexander whispered, his voice thick with sleep. "In a minute, I just want to watch the waves." "They'll be there in the morning, Maya. We're not going anywhere." I turned in his arms, looking up at him. He looked so peaceful. The Titan jaw was relaxed, the steward brow was smooth. He looked like the boy who had tried to run away with a backpack full of comic books. Alexander. And the fourth partner, Clara. We never really talked about what we're going to do with the prototype. Alexander opened his eyes, the gray iris catching the moonlight. "We're going to keep it. In the vault in the basement of this house. Not as a secret to be weaponized, but as a reminder of the heart. If the science ever gets too cold, we look at the prototype and remember why we started. And the ghosts, the ones your mother worked with. Marcus is tracking the shell companies, but they won't strike tonight, Maya, and they won't strike tomorrow. We've made the code public. There's no value in the secret anymore. The only thing left for them to want is revenge, and I'm a master of managing that particular risk. He kissed my forehead, a lingering, protective touch. The fallout is over. The claim is ours. Now, let's go to sleep. I want to see what you look like when you wake up in a house that doesn't have a security camera in the bedroom. Alexander POV, 3 a.m. I woke up to the sound of rain, not the freezing drizzle of London or the mountain storms of Zurich. This was a warm, late summer rain, a soft drumming against the glass that felt like a lullaby. Maya was asleep beside me, her dark hair a silk tangle against the white pillows. I stayed perfectly still, watching her. I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't known was possible. For 34 years, I had been building a fortress, thinking that if I could just get the walls high enough, I would be safe. I was wrong. I wasn't safe until I let someone in. I reached out and touched the gold band on my finger. The locked-in contract was a piece of ash. The sovereign protocol was a corrupted file. The Blackwood name was a redeemed legacy. I looked at the Vigil of Justice notebook, which was sitting on the nightstand. I reached out and pulled it toward me. I opened it to the very last page. Under Maya's entry, "The man who set her free," I wrote a new line. The private reunion. The moment the silence became a home. I put the notebook back and pulled Maya closer. She stirred, murmuring my name in her sleep, and moved into my heat. The room was full. The world was at peace. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to check the time. Maya POV, morning. I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of a hammer. I sat up, the sheets pooling around my waist. The sun was shining through the big windows, a brilliant, unshielded gold that made the Atlantic look like a sheet of diamonds. I got out of bed, pulled on Alexander's white shirt, and walked into the living room. Alexander was on the deck. He wasn't wearing a shirt. He was holding a hammer, fixing a loose board on the railing. He looked rugged, powerful, and utterly at home. "You're awake," he said, looking back at me with a grin. "What are you doing, Mr. Consultant?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm performing a structural audit of the sanctuary," he said, setting the hammer down. He walked over to me, his skin warm and smelling of sawdust and salt. He pulled me into his arms, his eyes searching mine. "How was your first night in a room without a camera?" he asked. "It was the best night of my life," I said. He leaned down and kissed me, a long, deep, and rawly honest kiss that tasted of the future. "I have a meeting at 10, I said, pulling back with a smile. Alexander frowned. "A meeting?" I thought the room was closed for the weekend. "It's with the director of the new children's neuro wing," I explained. "It's via satellite. You can sit in if you want. I might need a technical advisor." Alexander laughed, a real, rich sound that echoed over the dunes. "I think I can handle that, as long as the advisor gets a lunch break." "The advisor gets whatever he wants," I whispered, pulling him back into a kiss. The private reunion was over. The claim was our reality, and as we stood on the deck, looking out at the horizon, I realized that the story of the billionaire and the scientist was no longer about the fire. It was about the light, and the world was never going to be the same. Alexander POV. We spent the morning in the office. The oak table we had moved from the tower, now sitting in the corner of the sun-drenched living room. Maya ran the meeting with the precision of a master. I sat beside her, providing the data when she asked for it, but mostly just watching her. She was magnificent. She was the one who owned the room now, and I was the one who got to be in it with her. When the meeting ended, Marcus called. "Sir, the UN Commission has just released their final report. The Sterling Blackwood Foundation is officially cleared of all legacy liabilities. You're free, Alexander, truly. I looked at Maya, who was watching me with a hopeful expression. We're free, Marcus, I said. Thank you. I hung up and turned to Maya. I didn't say a word. I just picked her up and carried her out to the beach. The locked-in era was a memory. The fallout was a foundation. And as we walked along the shore, the sand between our toes and the sun on our faces, I realized that I had finally achieved the ultimate Blackwood goal. I had secured the only asset that was ever truly worth keeping, and her name was Maya. Maya POV, end of chapter 53. The sun began to set over the dunes, casting a long, orange glow over our house. I looked at the ring on my finger. It was just a band of gold, but it was the strongest thing I'd ever seen. I looked at Alexander, and I saw my husband, my partner, and my equal. We were no longer locked in. We were just us, and the world was ours to explore together. Next chapter, chapter 54, Future Talk.